All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good buddy Jeff Biggers. Jeff is a journalist and an author whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Nation, Salon. He is the author of several books, including State Out of the Union, Reckoning at Eagle Creek, and the United States of Appalachia, all of which and more you can find at jeffbiggers.com. You can also find him on Twitter at JeffRBiggers. Jeff, thanks so much for being on the show again.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
All right, so Jeff, both you and I met in Illinois a few years ago, and there is actually some very disturbing developments in the coal industry in Illinois. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Well, last week we had a couple of events that I think reminds people that the big coal is not simply an amazing influence in the South when we think of West Virginia and we think of Kentucky. But in fact, big coal got started in Illinois. The coal industry itself, had its birthplace in Illinois, and it continues to control the state, even a state controlled by liberal Democrats. And last week we had two things that happened that really were a shocker for the state, but once again, sort of a nice wake-up call. And the first one was there was a tiny strip mine down in central Illinois, a strip mine that had already been held accountable for 600 toxic discharge violations. Sort of blatantly breaking the law. The state had called them on the carpet. And then that's with one hand. And on the other hand, the state just says, okay, we're going to renew your permit, keep going. And it shocked the local people that, in fact, they can continue to operate these strip mines in flagrant violation of the law, and the state literally will turn its back. The reminder, of course, was that the state has never turned down a renewal of a permit for a coal mine ever. And that kind of revelation, I think, shocked the whole state of, we are not only dealing with a broken regulatory system, we're dealing with one that's just incredibly corrupt. Meanwhile, when everybody's still trying to recover from this kind of shocking news with just the mayhem of the coal industry, our Governor Pat Quinn, a liberal, of course, that comes from the Chicagoland area, comes out and says, hey, just as we're reaching the edge of an incredible milestone with carbon emissions, 400 parts per million, one of the tipping points in the climate destabilization, Quinn announces, hey, we've increased our coal exports by 5 times, and now Illinois will become one of the leaders in coal exports, which really, I think, is one of the tipping points in terms of just worldwide coal consumption. So really, it's a whole web of contradictions, but for the most part, of coal mayhem going on in the heartland right now.
So let's delve into the lack of regulation and the fact that this company has made countless violations and sort of the lack of corporate accountability. What exactly have they been found to do? What I mean, coal is a really, really dirty industry. What has this company actually done?
Well, you have to get a permit after you've mined the coal, you have to wash the coal, and then you have to store the slurry, and then they actually are dumping coal ash as well. But just to make it very simple, they're allowed to just discharge a certain amount of heavy metals and toxics into the waterways, this be creeks or rivers or the watersheds. And they're already allowed to do a certain amount, and you have to get a permit every time that you have a certain amount of discharges. Well, these folks had been operating for years without a permit, and it finally took the local people who were seeing that the local creeks, and this was a very historic creek called Grindstone Creek. It's one of the last great timber stands in western Illinois. It feeds into the Lemoyne River, which then feeds into a whole area of western Illinois. They thought the water literally was orange, and that the water had been contaminated. It's both very destructive to the wildlife, to the fish. It turns the water sterile, but ultimately you're leaking things like arsenic and lead and selenium and all sorts of really nasty toxic materials into ultimately the drinking water of the area. This, Matt, is sort of the equivalent that, let's say there's a truck driver who's had 600 DUIs. And he's driving an incredibly toxic, overloading truck, and he goes to the motor vehicle, and he has to renew his driver's license permit, like we all do, right?
And he's reeking of booze when he goes into the DMV. He's got a flask with him.
and he hasn't even paid for his 600 DUIs, and they're like, well, here's your license, but you be careful. And that's simply what we're having here in the situation. And they'll probably slap a little fine on them. But our regulatory system is set up as such that it encourages coal industry to become outlaws. Because it's the same thing. If you can get a little tiny fine for breaking the law, meanwhile you're able to double and triple or quadruple production, anybody who's trying to make money will go ahead and break the law. And that's essentially the kind of corrupt system we've set up that it really encourages people to break it.
Yeah, another thing, I'm not, I have no direct, I'm not sure if this is actually happening when it comes to this specific company, but I know for a fact that when a lot of Wall Street firms actually get fines, all of that stuff they actually can use as a tax write-off. It's a cost of doing business. And so technically, the taxpayers ultimately, through the tax code, end up footing, in a lot of different industries, these small, minuscule fines that these companies get for destroying the planet. We actually end up not just paying through the pollution and the results of the pollution, but we actually end up paying for the actual fines themselves.
Right, and the cleanup. There are 1,300 abandoned coal mines in Illinois alone. And who pays for those abandoned coal mines? We do as the taxpayers. Because ultimately the coal companies create these little tiny LLCs per mine, and once the mine is used up, basically they declare bankruptcy and move on, or cut their losses. And so ultimately we pay for the cleanup of these mines over the past 100 years. So they're extremely toxic, very dangerous. And we're not only talking about the coal discharges, but the maintenance of these coal slurry impoundments. Just to look at the whole aspect of Illinois in general, once again, the coal industry got its groove in Illinois. Francis Peabody, the largest coal company in the world, Peabody Energy, of course, was based in Chicago. It was Mr. Peabody who ran ads in the Chicago Tribune in the 1890s for clean coal. And so we've really been dealing with this kind of completely corrupt system since day one for over 200 years in Illinois. But meanwhile, the one coal-fired plant that was able to get through in the past couple of years was the Prairie State coal-fired plant just outside St. Louis. And now they're facing potential fraud investigations because they had promised electricity rates at a certain area. The construction rates had quadrupled. And the people who are having to ultimately pay the burden for the coal industry are the taxpayers down there who are having to pay their electricity rates. Meanwhile, you have a coal ash dump and coal slurry impoundments in central and southern Illinois, which are not being regulated. You have a coal education curriculum that's part of a coal marketing slush fund for Illinois that taxpayers are paying for. It just sort of, the list goes on and on to the fact for coal miners, the department has per the law, is supposed to have 16 inspectors for all the mines in Illinois, which already is a tiny amount. And right now we only have 10 inspectors. So even the state knows they're in violation by not even hiring enough staff to help the coal miners.